Hi, Mark, and welcome to the current Outside Views report on Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is sticking to his war goals in Ukraine, and no serious offers of talks have come from Moscow. And it seems as if the Kremlin chief wants to prolong the war. There are reasons that he could do that. It is this one sentence that the world public has heard many times since the beginning of the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has already lost this war. That was said by Joe Biden last in July. The US president was not referring to the military situation in which Russia and Ukraine are currently engaged in bloody trench warfare and the front lines are only shifting slightly. Rather, Biden was targeting Putin personally, who had to pay such a high price that he is already a loser. But is Biden right? Has Putin already lost? For the Kremlin, the annexation of Ukraine should be a first step in rebuilding a Russian empire. Putin wanted to demonstrate that Russia, along with China, was ready to take leadership in a new multipolar international order. But everything turned out differently. The Ukrainian army and its support from the West proved to be more resilient than was expected in Moscow. Russia, on the other hand, is weakened and is clinging with all its might to the areas in eastern Ukraine that have already been conquered. So Putin miscalculated. The price for Russia and the political elite is already so high that Putin has to fear the final accounts: his loss of life, Western sanctions against the Russian economy, and the international isolation of the Kremlin clique. And this is not all good news for the West and Ukraine. Putin's own miscalculations are the reason for the Kremlin chief to prolong the war. This is another reason why security experts and Western diplomats agree that peace in Ukraine is not yet in sight. This was also shown most recently at the peace summit in Saudi Arabia, where the peace plan of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was discussed without Russia. Although the meeting remained without any visible results, Ukraine was able to deepen its talks with countries like China. The basis of the Ukrainian peace formula is the integrity of Ukraine, a ceasefire on all fronts, the start of peace talks under UN supervision, and the exchange of prisoners. In principle, the 40 participating states can agree on this, but Russia rejects the formula. There would currently be no basis for an agreement, as Putin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told the New York Times on Sunday. We will continue the operation for the foreseeable future. With operation, he means the war. They just don't dare to say that. The fact that Peskov gave a statement to a US newspaper at all can be seen as a sign that the Russian leadership is coming under increasing international pressure. Putin knows that even China has spoken out in favor of the integrity of Ukrainian territory, and that becomes a problem for the Kremlin. In the end, Putin's war will of course also be measured in Russia by what it actually brought to the country. Russia appears militarily too weak to conquer the whole country. Even separating Ukraine from the Black Sea is probably impossible. On the contrary, the Russian soldiers dig in at the front lines and hope that the Ukrainian army will not be able to break through the defense lines. At the moment, Russia can hold most of the conquered territories. But in perspective, the situation is fatal for Putin. He is in a shambles. If the war were frozen according to the current front lines, there's what the Russian perspective would say on paper. Russia would have captured less than 20% of Ukraine. That sounds like a lot on paper, but not even the complete conquest of the Ukrainian oblasts of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Cherson has been achieved, and these were recently Putin's war goals. And Moscow wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, which is likely to fail. Instead, the country is being upgraded from the West and is moving closer to NATO. For Putin, this is a catastrophe. The Kremlin despot also wanted to denazify Ukraine, which Russian propaganda was allegedly preparing for a regime change. That went wrong. Zelensky is currently sitting more firmly in the saddle than before the start of the war. Apart from the high losses for the Russian economy due to the Western sanctions and Russia's decoupling from international markets, the Kremlin would also have to rebuild the occupied territories. According to the World Bank, this requires hundreds of billions in investments. That's a big bill for Russia. And in addition, Putin would have to deal with the Ukrainian population in the occupied territories who do not want to live under Russian rule. It would take great effort like deportation and resettlement to quell partisan movements. An official armistice would not automatically lead to peace. Even the Russian-speaking areas of the Donbass have been shaken, but also deindustrialized and depopulated as a result of this ruinous war. All in all, this is a major dilemma for Putin. In principle, he doesn't have any good options. His army has suffered great losses in this war, many Russian soldiers have died, much war equipment has been destroyed and must be renewed. This increases the pressure to succeed on the Russian leadership. But investments in this war of aggression were so high on the Russian side that in Moscow not only a cost-benefit calculation decides whether it will be continued. After the numerous Russian failures, it is now also about Putin's power. The dynamics of war have become a serious threat to the Russian regime. These are the side effects of such a conflict you can see. Defeats cast doubt on the wisdom and competence of leadership. Failure in war can lead to the fall of a government, and this is often why governments continue to fight wars. An admission of defeat could make it hard to remain in power. And that seems to be true of Putin as well. In order to escape the final reckoning, Putin must allow the fight to continue. Russia's president is likely hoping that Western military support for Ukraine will eventually dwindle. And after the 2024 US election, he must hope for a new US president who is no longer interested in Ukraine. Then Russia could play off its armaments industrial superiority over Ukraine and perhaps still win this war. But this is currently not possible. If the Russian president were to accept a ceasefire based on the current front lines, this would reduce the threat to Crimea and enable the Russian occupation of what is still a considerable part of Ukrainian territory. However, it would confirm that none of Putin's goals were achieved. While Russian state media could still tout this as a victory, it could fuel frustration among Russian elites. The head of the Kremlin must fear that his war in Russia will be settled before the end of the actual conflict. He is already preparing to deny responsibility, because Russian generals are being fired again and again, and Russian propaganda paints an ideological picture of a fight against NATO. But these attempts to explain the failure seem rather helpless. And the bottom line here gives hope to Ukraine, because all trends, militarily, economic, diplomatic, point in the wrong direction for Putin. And the Kremlin does not seem to have a convincing plan how to salvage the situation. Putin's bill will come. The only question is when. And if you want to know more about the developments in this war, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.